residents for basic needs. And the plan lays that out. There's multiple stages. Sandy will get into that. But we really want to make sure that this council is comfortable with the 4 stages that we have in plan, that we'll have in place, and that this is something that we can move forward with. And then again, as I mentioned, as opportunities present themselves for conservation, they will be considered on a kind of an as they come basis. So there's really nothing off the table. Water recirculation pumps, turf replacement programs, all of those things will be pieces of the plan as it continues to grow. So with that, I'm going to sit down and let Sandy speak, and at the end we'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Good evening, Mayor and Council members. I'm going to jump right in and differentiate, just to emphasize what Sean said, that we're talking about 2 different kinds of demand reduction planning tonight. The first is for conservation. That's lifestyle, takes long term, takes a long time to have effects in many cases. Also, the planning for curtailment is all about short, being short of water, taking effect fast, and having a quick impact on our demand reduction. So if you want to summarize the difference between these 2, even though there's overlap, that's it. Long-acting, long response, short-term, short reaction. We're going to start out with the conservation plan. Some of this is going to be familiar. We gave you a review of where we were headed in May, and indeed with input from all city departments and discussion, we seem to be headed in very similar directions. The first thing that this plan does is sets forth some targets for how much are we going to reduce our water use. We've set 2 different kinds of targets. The first is to reduce the amount of water consumed per person, not our overall use, because that's going to grow as the number of people and the amount of industry in the area does. But we can reduce the amount used per person by conservation efforts. In the next 7 years, we want to cut that by 10%, and in 5 more years beyond that, reduce it another 5%. To do that, one of the things we'll need to do is reduce how much the summer spikes over the wintertime usage, because that outdoor use that Sean alluded to is where most of the water is going right now. So we're making a secondary goal of reducing the peak demand, that's the multiplier between that highest day and the average annual day, by 5% in the next 5 years. How will we go about that? Our priorities are to first go after city usage. We have the most influence there. People will be looking at what we do. It's the right thing to do to be the leaders. So we'll first make efforts to improve our efficiency in city water usage. Second, we'll go after that big use, the outdoor use. No matter who is turning on the spigot outdoors, whether it's the city, commercial users, residential, we'll put a heavy emphasis on reducing that outdoor usage. And then residential makes up a smaller percentage, and last in our current usage is commercial and industrial, which makes up a very small percentage of our current water usage. And that will be growing most rapidly, and so it will be appropriate to be thoughtful and provide guidelines for where that heads in the future. The goals for the plan then follow directly from those priorities. The city will lead, so the city will take the kinds of actions necessary, set goals for itself, complete the city audit, use those recommendations to tighten up our water usage, establish that we build in the future to have more conservative, that is more conservation-minded buildings, etc. Second, we want to build customer commitment to conservation. So all the education efforts, the efforts to provide guidelines that may lead future development, ordinances, outreach, a Beat the Peak campaign, that all falls in this area. Third, we want to make sure the program is fiscally sound. So we'll ensure that our rate structures are doing things to provide incentives for conservation, and we'll be looking at the cost-benefit ratios related to both proposals and the outcomes of conservation efforts to make sure it's a fiscally sound program. We're not just throwing money after possibilities. Overall, then, we'll need to do some research. Technology is moving ahead. More folks are putting their mind to ways to save water while doing the things we need to do. So all the options that will be available in 2017 are not available to me to outline for you tonight. So we will be attending to those and recommending appropriate usage as we find them. And then finally, the fifth goal simply says that we will create incentives that amplify the cost signal to help people decide that conservation is what they want to do. Whether that's the kind of things that Sean mentioned, providing rebates and retrofits and helping with conversion, or that's through rate structures and other mechanisms. If we meet the proposed targets, by 2015 we'll be saving quite a bit of water. Every year we'll be saving enough water for 4,200 to 6,300 families. And 5 years after that, we'll be saving enough for 9,000 to 15,000 families. Pretty significant water savings we can expect if we can achieve these goals. So we're asking you to support these goals and the directions that we're headed to achieve them. And with that, I'd like to shift gears to curtailment. And now we're going to talk short action. I will try not to speed up, even though we're talking short. The curtailment plan, as Sean indicated, will primarily be used if we have disruptions of our supply. The state requires them in part because drought is a real possibility here in Arizona. But due to our dependence in this time interval on groundwater, we don't expect that would be what would trigger our use of the plan. It's more likely that something happens to our water supply, contamination from a plume or breakdowns of equipment or vandalism. And some part of our system is not able to perform properly. In that event, one of the things we need to do is make sure that we have the water we need for essential uses. So the city will immediately step in and start reducing our use and set the example for how we would go about that. When we decide how to reduce water for a short-term situation, which we're saying is the most likely scenario for these kinds of reductions, we want to do those that are most reversible quickly and first. You don't want to start in with the things that it's going to take a long time to recover from if you think that this shortage is only going to last a week, but we have to assure that people have water to drink and bathe with for a week. So we'll start with the quick reversible actions. Restrictions would be in place in stages, dependent on the mismatch between our supply and demand. So they progress in severity, and that's why red is at the bottom of the page. Stage 1 occurs when our demand reaches 90% of available supplies. And then we're talking about supplies we could deliver in 24 hours. If it reaches 95%, we'd go to a water alert, which has more restrictions. If the demand begins to exceed supply, or we anticipate that will happen, then we'd go to a water warning. And if there's a really severe disruption of supply, then we'd be in a water emergency, a situation which actually presents imminent harm to some of our residents, at least. How have we developed these staged restrictions, and what do they do? Well, it doesn't matter what's in there if we don't have people aware of what's expected and what's likely to happen. So the first thing that this plan keeps in mind is we have to get the word out about what the plan is in advance, and people have to be able to predict and understand what they'd be asked to do so that they can agree to do it without a long time interval before it happens. The restrictions would not affect health, sanitation, and fire because those are the essential uses we're going after. And we are also not going to impose restrictions where there is use of non-potable water. That's not the water that's needed for these uses, and in most cases the kinds of disruptions that we're thinking about won't affect them nearly as much. So those users of non-potable water would be required to sign that that's what they're using, so people know that they're not violating the restrictions, but otherwise they would be able to go ahead with their use. Incidentally, this provides a pretty strong incentive for one of the kinds of conservation measures we'd like to see. The ballpark would be exempt until we reach really severe cutbacks. This is because it's an important economic driver for us. For example, in stage 1, we would have mandatory restrictions for the city only. Residential users and commercial users would be on voluntary requests for reductions at that point. And most of the restrictions that would be in place for the city would be affecting our outdoor use, number of days, length of time that we water, those kinds of things. And we would oversee only at the Goodyear Ballpark and the sports complex, not our other parks, if we reach this stage. And of course, we'd only have to worry about that at the right time of year when it was overseeding time, if it was a short-term acting situation. If conditions progress through those higher levels of mismatch, then we would also progress in the steepness of the reductions in water use. First, by increasing what we require in the way of outdoor watering, stretching the intervals between, reducing the amount of water you can put on. We would begin to reduce construction demand, reduce the number of permits, hold back permits until some other ones are turned in, so that we're not generating new demand at a time when we're really having trouble serving existing customers. Go to the kinds of things that people are pretty familiar with now at green hotels, asking all hotels to hold off on the linen service every day and give customers a chance to request water at restaurants. Those would be the kinds of things that would begin to happen as the restrictions become tighter. By the time we get to stage 4, everyone is in mandatory restrictions, and they're pretty tight. At this point, we would stop issuing any construction permits. We have a severe mismatch. We're challenged to simply provide essential water use to those customers that are affected, and that's where we want the water to go. So one of the things we're looking for from you is, we understand if we got to a stage 4, this is something that might happen. We would only do this in a dire circumstance when we can't meet that demand.
Excuse me.
Yes, ma'am.
Where would golf courses, the multitudes of golf courses that we have in our city, where would they fall in some of these stages?
That will
Especially
depend.
overseeding, too.
Sure. Mayor and Councilwoman, that will depend on their water sources. Many of those are using agricultural water right now, which would be non-potable water, so it wouldn't be an issue.
Okay.
If they decide to go to reclaimed water, or if we're providing that, I know that's true at some, then that's also not an issue, because that's not part of the restriction.
Okay,
Okay?
thank you.
So each one would be evaluated at its time then?
It depends on their water source. If their water source is not part of what's been restricted, then they wouldn't be subject to those restrictions.
And we're also aware that when we start reducing the construction permits in stage 3, that could have a dire effect on our growth and the people that maybe want to participate in our community.
We do understand that. We're only suggesting that we're doing that when we have this severe mismatch.
Right.
I would point out also that it's a common feature among Phoenix area drought plans. We're not unusual in saying that we would go to that measure if we needed to. And also that, again, it would have to be a long-acting one before that would have a very big effect. If we put a restriction on for 2 weeks, someone has to hold off for 2 weeks.
It's not a big deal, right? I understand.
It's
So
somewhat
maybe
of a
we could put
deal, but,
longer-
it's something they could work on.
Aren't most restaurants already controlling the water? I mean, I've noticed most restaurants we go, they don't set a glass of water on the table unless you ask for the water. And I also the hotel towels, we see those little reminders in most of the hotels. Isn't that something we could do right at the beginning and not wait to stage a different stage? Is that something?
We're just suggesting that it's in stage 2, which is when the first mandatory restrictions show up. And you're right, that may be overcome by conservation. So when we talk a little bit later about how this plan would be changed over time, that's one of the reasons we would ask that might be an administrative action, simply as culture changes and things that we thought were a restriction are no longer pertinent because that's everyday practice. We'd take
Yes.
them out of the plan and
Yes, okay.
look for something that's effective.
Yeah, I consider that an everyday practice.
I understand. I have been to a few motels recently where they did ask me which I would prefer. So there would be one step beyond that to say, no, you don't get a choice.
Yeah.
And to follow Councilmember Lord's comment about the water. I think, I've been into some restaurants lately, and some of them, you're right, they don't serve, they say, would you like a glass of water? But then there are those restaurants that no matter what, whether you touch it or not, they bring you a glass of
I
water.
don't think that would be hard to incorporate.
I don't think
I don't think we'd get much static from the restaurants and the hotels. I think that affects their labor too, the time management.
How does this impact the, not necessarily the golf course, but the county residents that, for water users downstream that are outside the city? Can we enforce these over them as well? But we've got like Cerevel Garden, or Cerevel Gardens?
Yeah, several gardens.
Cerevel Gardens is a county island that we serve water to. Would they fall under these same things? So when you're talking through this, I should be thinking,
We would be imposing these types of restrictions on all those who are water customers for us.
seems-
Now, our enforcement measures, I might have to go back to somebody else for reference point on whether we'd be able to use the mechanisms we've proposed.
So that's when the incentives might become important for why they even started the conservation programs, right? In their little communities, or especially this county island that we're talking about.
One of the suggested measures also listed for the higher stages is that we might impose a drought surcharge. So there's a case of providing a financial incentive for compliance.
Sure.
If you're going to go over if you do any of the things that we've said you shouldn't do, you're going to pay extra for your water and help us cover the costs that are accrued.
City stopped issuing all construction permits. Is this, I forget, I think I saw a chart that said mandatory. Is this a mandatory thing?
This would be a mandatory step, yes, and it would say that all users would be unable to acquire constructional permits at stage 4.
We may not want to do that. I mean, if we're going to exempt, is the ball field exempt in stage 4?
The ball field is not
It's not what?
exempt from the watering restrictions. Is that what I'm not sure that's what you're asking about. though.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking if we're concerned about the ball field because of economic development, this is all about economic development. I don't understand a blanket stopping of construction permits. I mean, we can have the city manager and the city council make determinations as to what we would stop, but I think it sends the wrong message out there to those who want to develop and build in Goodyear that if we get into a water emergency, whether it's 3 days or 3 months, we aren't going to issue any construction permits, when in fact maybe that's the wrong thing to proscribe at that point. I don't see a need for a blanket prohibition there.
Be it special use permit at that point? Or just do them?
I just, bring it to council whether or not we need to stop and for whom. I mean, if you were going to build a hospital in Goodyear, I think I would be reluctant to say let's stop all construction permits for that hospital, and for other things maybe. I understand where you're coming from, I think, but a blanket prohibition doesn't seem in our interest at all.
But does that go back, Sandy, to what you were just saying about if it's a few weeks, if we get to this stage 4 water emergency, we have to do this for 2 or 3 weeks, it might delay something for a little while, but you would lift this stage 4, and we would go back to speeding up our business as usual till we're back the way we were. I mean, that's the goal? That's how you would get back to issuing all permits?
Yes, Mayor and Council Member, we would lift these restrictions as soon as that's possible based on our water supply. I understand your concern, I believe, and one of the things I would point out again is that most areas in the Phoenix area do have this exact provision, and they step into it gradually, as we are proposing to do, so that you don't go from issuing all permits to no permits. And it's not like everyone isn't aware that we have a water problem. We also have the ability in the suggested ordinance to declare such a stage 4 restriction for only a part of our service area if only a part of it is affected. So this might take effect if we had a break, say, in the Estrella main. Only Estrella is affected, but up there in Estrella, it's pretty important to conserve water for several days and to reduce your demand so that we don't get that storage tank down to zero.
That's right.
That wouldn't affect necessarily most of the rest of the area and all.
Yeah, the bullet says something else. Maybe if you're preparing an ordinance, you could specify that it's limited to specific areas.
Okay, and
But the bullet, which is what we're receiving today, is an overall blanket on construction permitting, which may not make sense.
It
Okay.
sounds harsh.
all of these restrictions would apply to whichever area that we have declared has a curtailment. And I'm sorry, I skipped over that. We can declare, this would suggest that we can declare a curtailment in any portion of our service area or for the whole service area, depending on the type of curtailment of supply that's occurring. So if it is only affecting Estrella, then as far as other water supplies are not going to impact Estrella or vice versa, they would be completely outside any requested restrictions. I think that maybe the portions that are coming up about how we would implement this may also alleviate some of your concern in this area.
No, I think that one of the problems is there's 3 bullets there, and one has specificity to it, the middle one, and the other 2 do not. The other 2 talk about tightening water restrictions. Don't know what that means. Can mean many things. And the last one is city manager may desire to do other things. Don't know what those things are. But we do
Right.
know that you're going to stop issuing all construction permits. I think that should probably have about the same openness as far as change and flexibility as the other 2 do.
Well, you could say the city may limit issuing.
No, that's,
The
Well,
word
you could
limit,
reword it
the
several
word
ways.
limit,
Stage 3.
instead of stops. I think it's the word.
That's true.
I think
That's what
limit,
she's already said.
and that, the limit could mean
You're already saying limit in stage 3, though. So I guess, what's the converse, Mayor? I mean, if you end up in a water emergency, I suppose for 7 to 14 days, I wouldn't expect that we're going to be stopping all construction permits. But we're always playing in a hypothetical world when we talk about these things. And hypothetically, if you end up with water being, down for a long duration, I would think the folks that live here now would have a big exception with us putting out a 2-inch water meter to the neighboring commercial development and then activating that.
I'm not sure they would. And we can't talk hypothetically when we're talking an ordinance. If we're going to talk an ordinance, we're talking a specificity. And that's what concerns me here.
Mayor, council members, Mayor, you raised a good question. I think as it relates to the ordinance, we can put some language in that provides us, dependent upon the issue at hand, if literally we were faced with a severe drought, or one of the concerns that we have living in the desert is a monsoon rolls through and a lightning strike takes out the Bullard Water Campus. That produces the bulk of our water. If it's literally providing water to our residents, albeit at a low pressure, or continuing to construct, I think the council would look to it to say, we need to provide the citizens that water. But if there's an ordinance that says yes or no, there needs to be some language in there that provides us that foresight, and whether it's through the city council or through the city manager, and we'll work with legal on that. We should be able to put some type of provision that says, depending on the specific emergency, that will allow us to enact certain things. I think that's a good point. Does that address your concern?
I think you can leave it with council, right? I mean, you come back and say, hey, these are a certain number of those items, I'm hearing you, Mayor, say
Yeah.
that
I think
maybe
that's-
should rest up here. The decision should remain with 7 individuals to say, you know what, we're going to stop construction for 6 months or 3 months or a week, right?
Yeah, I'm not opposed necessarily to that decision, but I just
Okay.
want it to be made in view of this particular circumstances affecting the construction,
Agreed.
and those who are footing the bill for the construction. And I don't want people to think when they come to Goodyear that if we have a water problem, we're going to shut off their water.
Yeah, sends a
You know,
wrong message.
We can do that if we need to, regardless, really.
Nope, that's a valid point. Thank you.
Maybe it reads that staff shall bring to council, items.
I wouldn't be
to
opposed to something like that.
Actually, I
it's going to
think
be on a case by case because it depends on the area and what the problem is. I mean,
That's the point.
Yeah.
Or you're getting to
So
your
it's a
next
case
slide,
by
aren't you?
case.
We're getting ahead of you.
that's actually the next
There you go.
slide
Answered our
is
question.
implementation. How would we find ourselves using any of these restrictions? When we're proposing that stage 1, 2, and 3 represent in overall the kinds of things that you would expect staff to handle, and so the city manager could declare that, you would be receiving information from Sean, our director, if we approach the condition where we are expecting to even go into stage 1, unless this is one of those sudden things that happens.
Can I interject something? And if I don't, it's going to keep snowing at me and I don't listen really well. The problem I find moving around from city to city, we get new move-ins all the time. And the people that move in never get briefed or never find out the information. And so they're living in a city a year or two, and finally they find out the information. So for this entire program, somehow you have to have the builders in with you so that when contracts are written, people are informed of what this is the city policy on water, because otherwise they're not going to know. They may through your neighbor, and so if we're going to do this kind of information, I would like to make sure that we recognize that we have constant people moving in all the time, and you can't depend that their neighbor's going to educate them.
That certainly a comprehensive and continuing education program is part of the plan.
Okay.
And it's written into the draft ordinance we have prepared also,
Yep.
that we would need to have a continuing effort. And that is
Thank you
important.
for listening, because I kept thinking about it.
Okay. The city manager would have the ability to issue restrictions and a curtailment for a portion of the area or the whole service area, depending on the conditions. If the conditions in some area of town reach what we call stage 4 types of mismatch, then we would go to the mayor for an emergency declaration and come to council for a ratification vote. So before anything would happen at stage 4, you all would be involved. We
And,
just want to
you
be
know,
able to act on that
On your
promptly.
bullet that talked about tightening, when you come to the council, you need to state, what are the particular tightening actions you're going to take, and what is the expected benefit from that
What's the
particular action?
result?
So we know, really, by making a decision at stage 4, what those tightening actions are going to achieve. Because you
We
may
shall
have
do
quite
so.
a few actions, some of which we won't have to take.
That's true.
Yeah.
And that is why the language you'll find in the ordinance and in the plan both talk about the word may, so that there's discretion. If it's not needed, you don't have to. And the city manager then may do some things beyond what are listed there because there might be more required. I appreciate the importance of that discretion. All stages and the restrictions and the supply status would be posted for everyone. In fact, you can see our status for the match between our supply and demand now on our website every day. It's reposted every week, so we would increase that frequency and make people more aware of that possibility if we got into these kinds of situations. Okay. So if we have something in effect, then hurry to make sure it actually is what people do, so that we have an effect by putting restrictions in place. We would enforce the mandatory actions only. If it's voluntary, that's what it means. We would encourage it, but we would not require it. In stage 1, 2, and 3, if there are violations of mandatory restrictions, we would anticipate we treat them as water waste. This is a situation where water is short. If you're using it in a way we've said you shouldn't, then you're wasting it. And
It's interesting when you say we're going to enforce that, because my daughter lives in Colorado. A lot of water. They had a restriction this summer on watering the lawns. But 2 houses down, the guy would cheat. So he had the green lawn among the rest of it. And that continued all summer. So when you say you enforce it, you got to think, okay, if we're going to put that word enforce, just how are we going to enforce that? Just what degrees are we going to go to enforce that? So just I'll throw that out to you, because that was a real life scenario. And there's a lot of frustrated people, and even public pressure didn't prevent the guy from cheating.
Okay. Well, we have the ability to issue citations right now for water waste, and so we would issue an educational notice and then follow up on that if as required.
Okay.
And again, we'd hope that most people will not take the response of the person with the green lawn in the midst of the drought. That's not what we're looking for. If we get to a stage 4, we consider that's a much more serious circumstance, and so then we would invoke our unauthorized use of water and water theft ordinance and suggest that we could issue a misdemeanor if people are violating the restrictions at that level.
And who do we think are going, is this going to be through the police department? Is this going to be through code compliance? Through the water department? I'm just curious, have we thought about that?
We have talked about that, and we would work with code compliance and water department. If we got to stage 4, there are more possibilities if we're really in a severe position, because if the mayor declares emergencies, we have some other options as far as what staff in different parts of the city might be asked to do. If there are no construction permits, there's different things happening.
If it's a business, Sarah, a developer or just a business in Goodyear, say the hospital, and they have a violation on stage 4, it's a misdemeanor, who do the police go to on the misdemeanor? I mean,
Fiduciary.
Hospital administrator.
is it
Water waste?
The admin? Yeah.
Same place the home builders went with us, the 7 of us sitting up here. They named all of that. I mean, I would imagine it's the same kind of.
So it would be against an individual, and that person would be basically charged with a misdemeanor in court. Yeah. I'm just not sure who that right person would be in some cases, but
But we already have that issue with with a water theft potentially, so I think we can resolve how to handle that problem. This is pretty much the end of my anticipated overview. We've dealt with some questions, but you may have more.
I have, through this whole process, are we going to come up with some kind of credits for energy-saving appliances? You know, like I know my daughter in San Diego bought this special wash machine, and she gets credit from the water department because it saves water. So, you know, you have the toilets, the showers, there's lots of those items in new construction, and say somebody is in a home they've had for years and they have to buy a new wash machine. Will they be able to come in with their receipt saying, I bought an energy efficient wash machine? Do I get a credit? Which I think they should be able to. So I'd like us to think about
Those
that
are
process.
the kind of programs that Sean was alluding to, and he mentioned several specific varieties of those, but there are many such things, and we would certainly look at the credit as well as the idea of a rebate where people actually get a cash payment instead of a credit on
And
the
I know
water
it's in the
bill.
literature, but I'd like it to be heard on
Okay,
at the council meeting.
and that's fine.
That kind of talking about the incentives that you would put out there for people to really watch for these things or watch these opportunities to say, sure. Yeah, because that was one of my questions about what were you thinking about from an incentive point of view. You mentioned it, but, I know it wasn't part of this presentation, but you had mentioned some of the incentives before. Mm-hmm. So, okay.
Right.
further questions or comments?
I have a question on,
Okay.
my question goes back to what Sean stated, and that was that we have to resubmit for 100 years supply of water. And if you can clarify that for me, now we have to guarantee that we have a 100-year supply of water, and now we need to resubmit that guarantee. Is that what that we have a 100-year supply of water? What does that mean?
The city has a designation of assured water supply, which says that the city has designated us that we have a 100-year sustainable water supply for the development that we've included inside that application, the demands that we've accounted for. What that essentially means is that we have the legal and physical availability of water, that we can pump it, that it's physically in the ground, or it's surface water that we can convey into the city, and that we have the financial capabilities to develop that resource. And we can do that through impact fees, development agreements, et cetera. the state has asked all communities that have an assured water supply designation to resubmit. And that was, the only purpose for that was to put all of the applications on a similar timeline and incorporate all of those demands into a regional water model that they're working on. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to expand our designation right now. We have a current designation for about 15,000 acre feet, and we currently use about 8,000 acre feet, so we're about halfway there. We've resubmitted at 81,000 acre feet. So we've said that we physically have available about 10 times more than we're currently using today. Now, the state may not agree with us. They may look at some things and say, well, we think it should be a lesser number. But we're fairly confident that we're going to get at least a 10 to 15-year designation that will allow us to continue to grow. And then as demand dictates, depending on how fast or how slow we grow, the state will require us to go back in and resubmit. And that's a periodic thing that they do every 10 to 15 years in the valley. So that's...
Well, so that, I guess what they're saying is, you submit that, and then 15 years from now, they want to hear again that there's still a 100-year water supply.
And
beyond that.
Yeah, the designation never goes backwards. So we have 15,000 acre feet today, and that's to serve all the demands that we've currently committed to. They won't come back and say, well, now you have 12,000 acre feet. It only goes in one direction. Now, they may come back and say, you have no more, and you're at 15,000, but they would not take water off the table. Once it's committed, it's in, and you're locked in. And what you've done is you've essentially said, all of these demands we've kind of entitled, and we said we will service all of this development. We kind of quantify what that is, and we show it's like a savings account. We have this much money in the bank, and we've got this many bills going out, and they have to balance. So once we've committed to paying that, once we've committed to servicing that demand, they won't take it away from us.
And you're also purchasing water
Always.
along the way.
Always.
Always purchasing.
Yes. Good question, though.
What if the city's ability to meet that demand drops below? I guess that's never happened, but what's the check and balance there? They issue us 15 MGD, 100-year water supply. And all of a sudden, a well goes dark, or a water source goes dark because of, tainted water supply,
Yeah,
or, we end up with 14 MGD. You're saying they don't, nobody double checks that?
No, what typically happens, Vice Mayor, is they will not allow us to reach our full build-out. So in our case, we have about 15,000 acre feet. Even if they hadn't asked us to resubmit, they would ask us long before we got to the 15,000 acre feet to ensure those sort of things, that they won't let us get to 15 and then say, okay, now that you're at your maximum, resubmit. They would call us in long before that. And the state doesn't really have a timeline or a specific 10%, 20%. It's just kind of they just look at it and they say,
Right.
you're
So
getting close.
You're always paying
they're
attention.
conservative,
Right.
even more so than we are.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. The way
Okay,
that was said.
I've been asked to move
Yes.
expeditiously to the next one. Because
Thank
we
you.
have to start at 6, is that correct? Because of the opening? Yeah. Okay. Hello?
Hello, good evening, Mayor, Kevin, members of the council. I will try to move through the presentation fairly quickly. Recently, questions regarding the city's policy on charitable donation bins were brought before the mayor and council. So tonight, we're just here to provide some information on staff's policy, on the city's policies, and give some options regarding charitable donation bins. Charitable donation bins are receptacles for the donations of goods.
Could you get a little closer to that?
Sure.
Thanks.
There are various types of charitable donation bins that can be seen throughout the West Valley. These range in size, color, and style, and they collect a wide variety of items, including clothes, shoes, toys, books, and recyclable materials. They're typically seen in shopping center parking lots. Here's some more examples of the charitable donation bins in the West Valley. They provide a valuable service to the community. They benefit a wide range of people, including the homeless, victims of domestic abuse, low-income students, and many more groups. They're a simple way for citizens to donate goods, and many are well-maintained, and others have owners that promote frequent pickup and monitoring of the bins. However, there are potential issues associated with these clothing or charitable donation bins. As you can see on this slide, items are sometimes left outside of the bins, even though signs on the bins instruct the donators not to do so. Here you can see if they are not properly maintained and frequently monitored and emptied, items can pile up around the bins. Additionally, if they're not properly located within a site, the bins can create traffic issues or take away from a commercial center's required parking. The city's current policy on charitable donation bins As far as staff has interpreted, the city code and zoning ordinance do not call out these charitable donation bins by name. Thus, when an organization recently requested information for placing a bin on a site, staff drew parallels between these donation bins and other similar types of outdoor accessory uses. As you can see, the development standards for commercial districts section in Article 3, the screening standards require all outdoor storage areas for materials, trash, equipment, vehicles, or similar items screened from view along all street frontages by a 6-foot wall. And the Article 3 also states that these should not be substantially visible from adjoining streets or properties. Currently, a site plan amendment application and associated fees for staff review would be required. This would be $630 plus $27 per acre, which is half the site plan application fee. In the review of a site plan amendment, staff would evaluate the visibility from public street, make sure the bin is internal to the commercial center, screening is adequate, required parking is not occupied, traffic circulation is not affected, the bin is not located along a fire access route, and the property owner has authorized the use. This chart is included in your council packet. Talking with planners and code-compliant staff from around the valley, it is clear there are a wide range of policies regarding charitable donation bins. Buckeye, Peoria, and Phoenix do not regulate these bins, while Chandler and Gilbert permit them with simple review processes, and they charge little or no fees. Avondale, Scottsdale, Surprise, and Tempe allow them, but they have a more involved process. Scottsdale does not require fees and does not have a set process for review, but would require the organization to provide a plan for staff evaluation. And Avondale, Surprise, and Tempe have stated that they would liken these charitable donation bins to outdoor storage or refuse containers and will require screening of the use, as well as a site plan amendment like Goodyear does. Glendale and Mesa do not permit the charitable donation bins. Like some cities have done, these charitable donation bins can be regulated through permits or fees. However, it may be difficult to determine how much regulation is needed. For instance, several issues that would need to be addressed include required screening and or colors, regulating the size, and if this is done, does this favor one charitable organization over another? Restricting the number of bins allowed on the site and their adjacency to one another. If more than one is permitted on a site, would approval be on a first-come, first-served basis? And what are the implications for other types of outdoor uses like recycling containers? Several options staff has proposed for discussion on this issue include permitting all charitable donation bins outright, few if any restrictions, and placement and appearance would not be evaluated by the city. We could also permit with simple standards and minor if any fees. All types would be permitted, few restrictions, and a new application would need to be created by staff with minor permitting fees or no fee at all. This would be an over-the-counter simple review performed by staff. We could also develop standards and establish a new application and fee for use. These new standards would specifically address charitable donation bins and would require a zoning ordinance amendment to incorporate these standards, and a new application and fee would need to be created for these bins. We could continue with staff's current interpretation and enforcement, or we could prohibit these charitable donation bins outright, or staff could encourage these bins to be placed within a business or against an exterior wall underneath an arcade. One example of this is a charitable donation bin that was recently in front of the Fry's on Litchfield Road, and then it was moved underneath the arcade next to the soda machines. That concludes my presentation. Are there any questions?
Before I ask for questions, is there a recommendation from the staff? There's 5 options. Which one would you like to see?
We had quite a bit of discussion. The permitting or prohibiting would obviously be the easiest.
Go back to that.
for staff.
Yeah, go back to the 6 options.
There we go. And which one are you suggesting?
We had a lot of discussion, and we didn't come up with a straightforward answer, I guess. Yes, we were just coming to you looking for some.
Well, it does look, the one that I notice is Safeway, on Indian School. And, oh my goodness, for a while there, it was taking up more than one parking space. Must have been 3. And so I do think we need to have some kind of guidelines, because it did get out of control.
You said on your the information that you sent to us, you said that option C, sorry, Harvey.
Yes, sorry.
You said option C would be the most balanced approach in terms of allowing the bins in the community. But I just wanted to kind of put in a word for some of the nonprofits, the smaller nonprofits that have bins out. And when we start charging fees and having to keep track of all the items, make sure they're not outside and keeping them all clean, they usually don't have staff. You know, they're small. They need the items that are coming in for their clients, but they're small, and so that's a problem that I can see if we start working with fees and trying to charge by size of a nonprofit or how much money they have in the bank that day.
But you need to
know.
get the information out to them, how you would like it
Right, from an
delivered and-
educational point of view, we
Educational,
absolutely
so that we
do.
don't end up having those situations where it's all over the parking lot.
Well, and I can agree to that. I would think that a permit and guidelines, I agree, I don't feel that there should be a fee. I kind of think that maybe we should have two different sizes allowed, because the book one that was over there at Fry's is not that large compared to some of the others. I also think that we do need to look at whether or not they are taking up the parking spaces, and who can be contacted in if it's being abused, that stuff is being left out. Who's the contact person? That would code would be able to say, hey, you're not taking care of this. And maybe that permit is just like with some of the storage bins, maybe they are annually addressed. Maybe we say, hey, you know what, you've done a good job, you've kept it clean, you can have it another year. You know, maybe that's something else.
But it's what they drop off. Because I've noticed some of the things, one could never put it in a bin, it wouldn't fit. So now we have that problem. Okay, you know, you've got a tricycle sitting there, and
Sure.
you've got, I mean, so it's, the problem can
Well,
become monumental for the,
Sure, and that might go back to those guidelines that we're talking about, and when something like that happens, the items should probably be taken to the nonprofit headquarters or to, you know, to their regular drop-off center rather than leaving it in the convenience of a bin. But, you know, a lot of times when people want to get rid of things, they don't care. Their name is not on that tricycle. They just want to get rid of it, so. Yeah.
Vice Mayor?
I tend to think we keep this simple. So, property owner agrees to have the bin on site. It's up to the property owner whether they want it on there or not. They take responsibility for it. If it's not clean, it's the property owner and the management company. It's an agreement with them and the nonprofit. If the nonprofit abuses it, it keeps the relationship between the property owner and them, and not between our permit desk and them or code enforcement and them. If there are issues associated with it, their normal landscaping crews ought to come up and clean these items up. You know, I mean, it's an agreement that's between. This is a philanthropic venture. I don't want to slow it down. I found it humorous that Mesa doesn't permit them, but I was the guy who allowed the Boys and Girls Club to put them behind the fire stations when I worked at the fire station, because we had a partnership with them, and we didn't have any problem with them. Firefighters took care of their places, though, so they threw the stuff away if it didn't show up. But I think we keep the relationship as much as possible between the property owner and them, and if we have an issue with it with code enforcement, we go to the property owner. We don't call the nonprofit. We don't have to track them down. Maybe a small permitting application that they have a letter that's signed off by the property owner that we maybe give the template out for, that they sign off. Maybe it's a $5 or $10 or $25 fee, but not $600. That's, you know, now you're talking about taking away a philanthropic venture. So I tend to say
property owner is going to sign off on
B,
it.
I don't want to send staff out in the field to take pictures of this thing, to review it. I think there ought to be standards. If you happen to drive by it and it doesn't meet those standards, then we can interject with the property owner or the nonprofit that we have on file at that time with the permit.
I like that.
And leave it at that.
it
Otherwise,
easy.
if the nonprofit doesn't agree, cut the top off it, make it a dumpster, and put it into service for us, generating revenue.
Let me try to summarize. I think, and I'm not sure, Joanne, you need to step in here because you aren't recommending developing standards, but I think you are recommending a
Like a
permit.
simple standard.
Right, okay.
You know.
Simple standards. How about simple standards, permitting with no fees?
You know,
And that satisfies Brenda.
Generally speaking, the color ought to be, I don't want to see
That.
Well, yeah,
Fluorescent
I
yellow.
want to be sure
Isn't
that there is the name of the person that's responsible, i.e. the business owner or what. I think we need to have that on file so that when there is a question, you know who to go to. So
And Councilmember
it
Lord.
may not be the nonprofit, it will be the business.
I have seen quite a few recent permits and things like that we've researched that do require, the bins to have certain information on them, to provide certain information to the city, provide with a nonprofit, because some of the bins are by profit corporations. So, the proof of nonprofit, things like that.
I think proof of nonprofit, maybe you cite the littering statute. If somebody doesn't, if they put an item next to it, they're littering, they're not contributing,
Educate them.
those kind of
I
things.
think it's the education part of it.
Is that
Seems simple.
okay?
Is that enough guidance?
That sounds good.
Harvey, you good with that one? All
Okay.
right.
Thank
Okay,
you.
5 minutes.
we'll start at 6. Meeting's adjourned.
5 minutes? All right.
By the way, just
Happens around, it gets thrown.
Dick is in the hospital.